Hello and welcome to this lecture, and in this lecture we will discuss about how to name certain things while writing Python code. So I actually mentioned, or I actually explained you guys the importance of writing clean Python code, but there is one trick I would like to give you guys which is eventually going to help you when you appear for your interviews. So in a lot of interviews, what happens is that when programmers are actually assigned a certain task to do or certain code to write, obviously when you're writing it on a whiteboard it does not matter, but when you're actually asked to code on a machine, what some interviewers actually do is that they actually look at how efficient your code is, that is how logically efficient your code is, as well as some of them actually pay attention to how systematically or how cleanly you write that particular code. Now this does not happen in all of those interviews, but if you actually work on writing clean code, that is eventually going to set you apart from other candidates which are going to appear for the interview. Obviously you need to learn other things as well, but this is actually going to be an added advantage or an added skill which could make a difference. So please make sure that you don't ignore this section just because it does not matter. This is actually one of the most crucial sections if you actually want to become a professional programmer. Okay, so I guess that's enough for the tips. And now let's move on to the core content of this lecture, that is naming conventions. So the first rule for naming convention is that classes should always be named in a Camelcase format. So a Camelcase format is nothing but, let's say if you have to write something like, let's say a new number, so instead of typing just new underscore number, in Camelcase what you do is that you type something wherein you have the first letter of your word in capitals. So you type N capital, you type new, and then for the next word you again start capitalizing the first letter, so you type number. So this is one of the most efficient ways to name a particular class, because this actually makes it easier for any programmer or any person who is maintaining your code easier. Because if you write something like, let's say new number, as you could see, it's relatively difficult for anyone to read this and figure out what this actually means. And if you could notice, the Camelcase actually looks much better, and also it's much more readable as compared to the other two formats. So while declaring any class, you always make it a point to define it using a Camelcase. So let's take an example. So let's say you want to define a class which is new students. So you could type in class new students. So this is one way of doing so, but if you could notice, this thing is not Camelcase and it does not look readable at all, and even if you hover over it, it is going to say class name should use Camelcase convention. So a better way of writing the same code is typing class new students, and as you could see, the Camelcase looks much more appropriate and much more readable. So this was rule number 1 about naming conventions, and the next rule is that functions and variables should always be in lowercase. So this was all about classes. Now let's say if you have to define a function, so while defining a function, let's say if you have a function which you want to name calculate total, so instead of defining that thing as, let's say, calculate total, so this actually is syntactically correct, but instead of doing so, what you do is that you define function names in small letters. So you could type in calculate total. So what this actually does is that if you actually define functions in this type of syntax, programmer actually understands that this thing is a function. On the other hand, if you specify something in Camelcase, that means the programmer immediately realizes that this thing is actually a class. So while writing in the functions, always make it a point to write it in lowercase letters. And also, let's say if you have to pass certain variable over here, you always type it in lowercase as well. So instead of passing in number over here like this, as you could see, if you hover over it, it says argument name should be lowercase. So let's type in number in lowercase, and as you could see, we have no problem. So even if you have to define a particular variable inside your function, always make it a point to type it in lowercase. So as you could see, you could define result equal number over here. So this actually is going to make your code much more readable and understandable by your co-workers. So now the next thing, or the next rule, is that the instance method should always use self as the name of first parameters. So let's say you are defining a class. So if you type in class, let's say student, and you define a certain method over here. So let's say you type in method name as display name. So what you do is that you type in def, let's say display underscore name, and as soon as you type the first parentheses, as you could see, self is immediately included as the first parameter. And this is the by default case wherein you have to pass the first parameter or for the instance method as self, because that's what the convention actually states. So you have to keep these three things in mind while you actually name your functions, your classes, and your variables. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Thank you.